In practice, now that NOAA's actually had to act on the law in these situations, does the law look like it could be improved? I know that Senator Bill Nelson from Florida has recommended an amendment to the law. Where do you stand on that?
So, first I think it's probably helpful for viewers to understand clearly that the reauthorization in 2006-2007 did something very important in that it set specific deadlines to end overfishing for overfished species, and to require rebuilding schedules, including catch limits and accountability measures to ensure that we stay on course with rebuilding fish stocks. And I think that is an interest that we share across this agency with fishermen around the country, because every fisherman, and I'm one, would certainly love to have more fish out there to catch than less, and we should all work together to achieve that objective. And I think we have some opportunity, particularly when you set deadlines, to make sure that happens in an effective manner.
So the intent of the law was to try to get the wiggle room out of there to make sure something happened.
The intent of the law was to set some more rigorous requirements associated with moving forward with the work that we all believe is important. Now, having said that, obviously there are challenges. We already spoke to the stock assessment challenge. There's another challenge that is particularly important to recreational fishermen, and that's the one of catch and effort data. And one of the other things that the new Magnuson reauthorization did was establish a basis for which to improve recreational data. And so we have been working since passage of that reauthorization on improving recreational catch and effort data. And there are a number of elements to that work. Prominently among those are the establishment of the National Registry. And so many of the recreational fishermen around the coast now are either dealing directly with registration under the federal process, or seeing their states put in place new coastal angler license requirements that qualify that state to be exempt from the federal registration requirement. So that will be a very important step in improving catch and effort data. So if we have good stock assessment, we have a better understanding of catch and effort, then we can more effectively get on with the business of rebuilding stocks. In some cases, obviously, we run up against some pretty tough choices that we have to make, like we face in the South Atlantic right now with red snapper. And so I think that as you look at a stock like red snapper, where you've closed the directed fishery and still are not achieving the rebuilding effort that we aspire to and that is prescribed under the Magnuson Act, there are some legitimate questions about what else might come into play to help balance, if you will, the shared interest in rebuilding those stocks with some of the acute economic and social impacts associated with some of these large directed closures. Now, we haven't taken a firm position on any of the legislation at this point, and I need to be upfront in saying that, but we are very much open to some discussion, particularly in some of those particularly acute circumstances, such as the ones I just described.
Right. Well, I was going to ask about economic impact of some of these closures. American Sport Fishing Association did a survey of the states nearby, I guess it was Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, and determined there was a pretty significant impact. I can't remember what the number is in terms of lost sales of tackle shops and so forth.
Right.
Does the law allow you to take that into account in your assessment of these issues, or is it just an unfortunate byproduct of needing to address the reduced stocks?
Well, the law does take into account economic impacts in much of the management decision-making process, but it does admittedly place it secondary to these rebuilding requirements in the case where you've got an overfished stock or one that is undergoing overfishing. And obviously that is something that both as it relates to recreational fisheries but also in commercial fisheries we pay a lot of attention to in the way that we try to craft management strategies that meet the intent of the law but also minimize some of those economic disturbances.
Was the ASA data helpful to you? Was it reviewed here?
Oh, absolutely. And before I came here to NOAA Fisheries, I had a long-standing relationship with ASA and with some of the other big national recreational sport fishing organizations through a time that I served as the resource director for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and we worked with state fish and wildlife agencies, federal agencies, and fishermen organizations all around the country during that time. We worked a lot with the National Survey of anglers and boaters and hunters, and so I have a long-standing and deep familiarity with and appreciation for the economic impacts associated with recreational angling.
Great. Back to that question about Senator Bill Nelson's legislation, just to clarify, when you said we don't have a point of view, but we're thinking about it, is that what you were referring to, or are there other pieces of legislation as well?
Yeah, we don't, well, I mean, there have been other pieces of legislation in discussion along those same lines, and we just, my only point here as I sit here today is to be clear that we have not, as an agency, taken a firm position in response to that legislation. We have provided some technical support to some of those discussions.
So why has National Marine Fisheries Service been on the wrong foot, so to speak, when it actually came to having data it could rely upon to make better decisions about the stocks, as opposed to just be more or less forced to accept data that was a little bit old and then act on it? And this should be an easy question for you all to talk about, because it's about previous administrations, not the current one. Your track record hasn't been established yet, in a sense. So it's a question about the history of the National Marine Fisheries Service. Was it underfunded? Well, how does one explain this situation?
Well, I think you can first explain it by recognizing the magnitude of the challenge. As you move not only geographically around the country, but given the diversity of species that exist, and the diversity of habitat types and and needs associated with those species. So we're talking about, for example, species that have fairly substantial migratory patterns, anadromous species that move inland and out to sea, that interact with various fisheries in a variety of different ways. So it's not necessarily an easy undertaking. Somebody said counting fish is as easy as counting trees, except they are underwater and move around. Mm-hmm. And so I think, regardless of the administration, to be fair, it's important to note that there is a big challenge. And it is, I think, also important to note that while you would always like to have better data and more timely data, and there are plenty of places that we can point to where our data shortcomings have created management challenges. When you look around the world, we lead the way in this country in understanding the status of our marine fish stocks, and so it's not that I think anybody historically has done a poor job. It's just that the job in many ways is frankly overwhelming, and even by going to the southeast and spending another $5 million, we recognize we've only marginally improved our ability to more frequently assess major stocks, and we have lots of minor stocks that are still in need of basic data. And there's been an estimate that was prepared here that I think is a pretty fair estimate that, as I recall, identified a price tag of about $125 million a a year just to bring all of the major stocks up to a fairly regular routine of assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that, again, involves at-sea work, and some of that involves collection of data from other sources, and all of that coming together to be, crunched by statisticians and others and biologists into a good picture of what's going on out there with the stock in any given year in any given place. So it's a big challenge, and I don't think that the fact that we haven't always met the challenge should be perceived by anybody as historic failure on the part of biologists or this agency. It's just a big challenge.
I'm glad you brought up that budget question again. You said originally that the additional funds being allocated to help research the stock issues was $10 million, but you said that was incremental. What are the funds today committed by NOAA to understanding these stocks? And
yeah, so as we sit here, Ned, I don't have that figure on the top of my head, but I will be happy to get you something on that.
Fine. Okay. Well, we'll plug it in.
Yeah.
Is it sufficient? In other words, in a world where we spend so much on so many things, it seems like a $10 million additional spend against such an important industry, both commercially and recreationally. I'm sure you would agree it's not a lot of money, unless that's all that's needed, in which case I applaud you all for only spending what's needed.
Well, I don't think that we would ever say it's all that's needed. I think we're always in a situation where we're making tough choices and prioritizing based upon not only our realities, but realities around us. And we all know the kind of economic circumstances that we have across the country right now. We understand the pressures they place on federal budgets. We understand the pressures they place on fishermen and fishing communities around the country. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to, in part, articulate the trade-offs and do the best job, obviously, that we can with the resources that are appropriated to us, and identify, what else we could obtain with additional resources. But I also don't think that we should necessarily expect to be, in a utopian set of circumstances that relates to having all of the dollars that we need. So would we like to have more dollars? Could we use more dollars? Certainly in some cases there would be clear benefits, but we also recognize the realities of the circumstances that we're all collectively under.